Good afternoon and welcome to Stock Talk. My name is Pam Iwanchesco and I will be your host. Manitoba Agriculture is offering a series of livestock and forage webinars to help Manitoba beef producers. The webinars have run monthly until this month. We are glad you can join us for today's presentations. A few timely reminders. MASC has a variety of insurance programs to cover off specific crops and coverage situations. The Livestock Price Insurance Program, which we held an information webinar about 2 months ago, is on our Manitoba Agriculture YouTube channel, as are all of our other recorded webinars. Contact your local MASC office for more information. MASC also put out a small short video on their YouTube channel regarding the livestock price insurance, so be sure to check that one out as well. They also have a wildlife damage compensation program offered by MASC, which has 2 components, and you don't have to have MASC contract to be eligible. The program compensates producers who suffer losses due to attacks from predators. The Manitoba precipitation map is showing parts of the province which are very dry and below 100% normal, with the exception of some northern and interlake areas. There will be weekly crop reports becoming available at the end of the month, so be sure to check those out. Also a reminder that there's the Verified Beef Plus program through Manitoba Beef Producers. If you're looking at investing in some specialized equipment, such as herd management software or RFID readers, be sure to contact MVP for more information. So as for our webinar today, I'd like to introduce our 2 speakers. Please feel free to submit questions into the Q&A section as you come up with them, and we will answer them as best we can at the end of each presentation. So first up, we have May Elsinger, who's going to be talking about range and pasture health. And May Elsinger studied land reclamation and rangeland science at the University of Alberta. In her career with the federal government, she has used her talents in plant ID and a good understanding of how landscape and soils influence plant communities and how livestock utilize them to do health assessments and management recommendations for both community pastures and private pastures. She was introduced to the concept of range health indicators in 2000 in Washington, D.C., and then participated in the creation and implementation of different rangeland health assessment versions in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. And after May, we will have Miranda Meehan from North Dakota State University, and she'll be talking about gearing up for the grazing season. And Miranda is an associate professor at NDSU in the Animal Science Department and the NDSU Extension Livestock Environmental Stewardship Specialist. The focus of her research and extension program is livestock and environmental interactions. Her current research focuses to include integrated crop livestock systems, precision grazing technology, riparian ecology, brine spill remediation, and reclamation. Current extension programs focus on reclamation, grazing management, livestock water quality, and integrated crop livestock systems. In 2020, she also took on the role as Extension Disaster Coordinator and has led NDSU Extension's drought, blizzard, and avian influenza response efforts. So please welcome both of our speakers, starting off with May.
You're on mute, May.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully you're seeing the correct screen share.
It all looks good.
Awesome. Thank you, ladies. Yeah, so I'm excited to talk to you today about pasture health assessment. And I'm going to give you a lot of slides, a lot of details. But be assured that I will also give you the sources of the information for you to look up on your own time to get those really nitty-gritty details of how to use the pasture health assessment systems. So, in trouble advancing. There we go. So these are the, well, this is the primary pasture health assessment method that we use, some of which we've adapted to Manitoba. Alberta in the early 2000s developed pasture health assessment methodology for native grasslands, tame grasslands, and also wooded pastures. And this is a citation. Now, if you just go onto Google and type in Range Health Alberta, one of the options should be the Open Government Publications database, in which you can select and find this guide that I've shown here. In Manitoba, we have adapted the native pasture health portion, and you can find that in the MFG website under projects. So a roadmap for today, I want to give you a quick warm-up, what we're talking about with the pasture health. I'll discuss the concept of pasture health, how we do it, show you some variants of the pasture health, and then do a quick review. So for the warm-up, let's look at some photographs. Here we have a crested wheatgrass stand. It's 95% crested wheatgrass. And but obviously I wouldn't call this healthy. There's some weird things going on with it. It's not going to be functioning to produce a lot of forage for cattle to eat. And there's probably going to be water and sedimentation issues. Carbon sequestration is going to be inhibited as well. Here's another pasture. It's both sides of the fence has the same mixture of plants, but for some reason on one side the functioning isn't happening. There's too much litter. It's stifling things. The grasses aren't allowed to go to seed. How about this this woodland area? Is it healthy? I'll give you a hint. We're looking at the next one. Obviously, there's a greater capacity in this woodland. There's a lot more structure. There's a lot more biomass happening. I would suggest that this image is healthier than the previous image, in which there's very low productivity in the understory. I see bare soil. It could be doing a lot better and performing its functions in a better manner. So the concept of pasture health is it's like the human body, you know. Is it healthy? Is it able to perform the functions that we need it to? So there are many functions that we're thinking of. I mentioned a few previously. There's carbon sequestration, there's feed for animals, there's wildlife habitat, there's the ability of the site to sequester water, to slow sedimentation or downstream flow, to prevent flooding downstream. Many different things. And so in order to measure that, we look at various indicators. So let's think about the human body, for example, to describe, okay, the function or service that we need to be able to walk, run, climb with our legs. In order to do that, we need articulation and support of the legs, feet, and hips. In order to do that, that's the function of those, to support and bend. When the system is unhealthy, you're going to find yourself using the elevator a lot. You can't climb stairs. Maybe you walk with a cane. Maybe your exercise is reduced. Those are potential dysfunctions of when it's healthy or not healthy. So when it's healthy, you're able to climb stairs easily. You're able to run a race. You can play sports. You can do a lot with those legs. So the indicators that we might look at is, or if a doctor is assessing you, what indicators are, you know, can you walk in a balanced fashion? Do you have the full range of motion of your joints and your legs? How many minutes of activity can you do with those legs? Do you experience any pain with those legs if they're unhealthy versus healthy? So if we think about a pasture, the service and functions that we want to provide, we want to be able to get cattle feed off of a pasture. And the function that provides that is primary plant growth. Lots of plants creating lots of feed for the cattle. If the pasture's unhealthy, you're gonna have small plants. You're gonna have unpalatable plants that the cattle don't benefit from. If it's healthy, you're gonna have lots of plants. They're gonna be big. They're gonna be palatable and very nutritious for the cattle. So indicators in the community that we could potentially look at are, what plants are growing there? What is the plant community composition? What is the structure and function? Do we have legumes? Do we have grasses? Do we have a variety of different plants to provide different nutritional profiles? Is the ground covered? I mean, if you're looking at bare soil, well, cattle can't eat bare soil, right? And then is there any noxious weeds or woody encroachment that are among the less palatable plants for cattle, and therefore stealing resources that could be used by more nutritious and herbaceous plants. So when we do pasture health assessment in Western Canada, we're quite often looking at these major indicators. Are the plants growing there that we want to grow? Do we have a variety of different structures and functions, including high productivity plants, less weedy plants? Do we have the insulation benefits of dead plant litter on the soil to protect soil, to keep it from washing away, as a step in nutrient cycling? Is our soil stable and protected? It's not washing away, it's stuck in place, and it's well protected and covered by live vegetation or litter or moss or other things. And we have a lack of noxious and invasive weeds. These are weeds that are particularly risky because they can take over an entire plant community, and obviously they can not provide functions of adequate feed. And yeah, same for brush encroachment. So we have a questionnaire built in which we rate all of these indicators. So I'm going to show you the questionnaires today. Again, there's a lot of detail here. I just want you to get a feel for the types of questions that we're asking and some of the particular items to look at and understand. So there's 3 different variants of pasture health. I'm going to focus on the tame pasture variant, which is a pasture that had been seeded once and is managed primarily for feeding livestock. So the first question again, are the plants growing there that we want to grow? We have the option if it's a very old tame pasture, and it may have been invaded by certain other species. We have the option to answer question 1B. So basically, if it's 50% or more tame forages, then we can answer the primary question 1A. And if it's 50% or less, then we have the option to answer 1B, which would give us better points than if we answered it, with the perspective of the 1A alone. So there's some definitions on the right-hand side of what we mean by some of the technical terms in that. So tame forages are forages that come from away off of this continent, whereas native forages would originate in the northern parts of the Great Plains. Forage is that which is edible for grazing or browsing animals, and desirable forages in the tame pasture are going to be those that are edible, nutritious, and abundant. In the 1B question, they use the word included. So that just means any palatable forage, whether it's native or tame. Now, the second part is structure and function. For the tame pasture, we're looking at, is the community dominated by tall forages? So tall forages, productive forages, we're looking at brome grass, orchard grass, timothy, alfalfa, sweet clover. And then if you end up addressing some of the native species, then it'd be big blue stem, porcupine grass, and a few others. And are these big forages, are they growing well? Are they healthy, not stunted? So by low productivity forages, which we would rather not have on the pasture, we're talking about June grass, and white Dutch clover, red top, and on the native side, blue ground grass. So these are, potentially edible forages, but there's such low productivity that we'd rather have those abundant ones like the brome and the alfalfa. The second part of structure and function is understanding the abundance of weedy and disturbance-induced species. Generally unpalatable, generally indicating that, yeah, this is a disturbed plant community. And there's some risk here if we have too much of that. So we're not penalizing the noxious invaders, the particularly bad weeds yet. Those are penalized in a separate question. Basically, we're looking at nuisance weeds, things that aren't edible, that we normally see on a bare spot, like dandelions, strawberries, yarrow. These are plants that increase with overgrazing and when soil is exposed. So in this question, we're not counting Canada thistle, we're not counting leafy spurge, we're not counting absinthe, those particularly bad noxious weeds, because those are penalized in a later question. So plant litter, protective cover. So what we're doing here is we're assessing the abundance of plant litter. We understand plant litter to have a huge number of functions. It keeps the soil cool, it reduces raindrop impact, prevents erosion, stifles weed seedlings. It's a step in the process of adding organic matter, particulate organic matter to soil, all of that. So the way we look at this when we're doing a pasture health assessment is we'll go out on a pasture, we'll pick a representative area, trace a 20 inch by 20 inch square or 50 centimeters if you're metric. And what we'll do is we'll hand rake all the dead litter and see how it looks like in our hands. And if I go to the next slide, you'll see what the litter looks like in the hands and how it corresponds to the different amounts of litter per acre out of this 20 inch by 20 inch square. So these images are in all of the guides, all of the workbooks that are used for assessing pasture health. So I'll go on to the soil questions. So we start with soil erosion. Is the soil washing away? It's easy to assess on a macro level where we're looking at small and large gullies, we're looking at large root exposures, or trails that have become U-shaped because the soil is washing down them. But we also want to assess early signs like micro erosions. For example, are the root crowns of the plants exposed? We're talking grasses, like smaller plants. Are there mini dams made that we can see of the fine litter material? Is it being washed and dammed up against plants? Are there smooth surfaces where we do have bare soil? Is it a smooth surface that appears to be washed? So there's a fine amount of soil that's being washed, so that's micro erosion. Or sometimes if the soil is a bit looser, you'll see little dishes in the surface of the soil that indicate, okay, when a raindrop comes, it impacts the soil and the drop splashes and creates this little dish. And then in some places you see hoof shear. We include animals as forces of erosion. And so if we see excessive footprints, then that's a micro sign of erosion. So the next soil question would be exposure. How much soil is exposed? Now, in this question here is for the Alberta assessment. So they have mixed grass areas and dry mixed grass areas. We don't have that in Manitoba. We have more of the black and gray soils. So we'll have something that's more like parkland type of soil, or else the wooded soils. And so in those more fertile soils, we have stricter limitations for the amount of bare soil that is allowed. Now, when you're assessing the bare soil, you need to look pretty close because sometimes, okay, you'll be looking down at the plant community, you'll see a lot of dark patches. But it could be rotting litter, or it could be a thin layer of moss or algae on the top that's protecting the soil, that's covering the soil and keeping it in place. So you got to look a little close to make sure it's actually bare soil that is exposed. Now we're going to penalize our noxious weeds, our particularly bad weeds that produce huge risks on the landscape. So, there's two parts to it. We assess the cover over the overall area, but we also want to get a sense of how those weeds are distributed, because we're going to see a lot less risk of a single patch of a weed versus if they're continuously uniform everywhere. All right, so the workbooks provide this visual guide here of how we can quantify the distribution of the plants. So which plants do we consider noxious weeds? Well, in Manitoba, we do have the Noxious Weeds Act, which has under it the noxious weed regulation. And it has the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 weed designations. So for the Manitoba range and pasture health listing, we've selected all of the tier 1s and all of the tier 2s. So yeah, I'm not going to use any examples. It'd take too much time, but tier 1 and tier 2 are the really bad ones. Tier 3 are kind of more of a nuisance. And then we've also selected like the stakeholders that designed the Manitoba Pasture Health. They came up with a few additional species that concern them. So that list is in the appendix of Manitoba's Range and Pasture Health Workbook on the MFGA website. And then Alberta has their own list. It's not overly different from the list we have. But again, the target is a particularly bad weeds, not the nuisance ones like dandelions. And then brush. We like to assess brush encroachment. We do not want our pastures to be taken over by woody species. The shading changes the vegetation, it reduces the productivity, and it can be a nuisance for herd animals which prefer wandering through open spaces. It can restrict cattle movement. So in a similar fashion, we're looking at the cover of the bush, but also the distribution of trees. Like one clump of trees ain't so bad, but if you have continuous single random ones throughout the pasture, well, pretty quick, some of them can become more of a problem, so a greater risk. So at the end of answering all those questionnaires, we have a bunch of numbers, we add them up. 100 is the maximum amount of points you can get. If you have 75 to 100, you have a healthy pasture, and with very minimal to no impairment of the functions, and it will provide all of the services that you need from it. No action is needed to make any changes. But as you get more down towards 50 points, you end up with healthy with problems, in which case you might think about doing some minor tweaks to your management or your infrastructure. Generally, those are low cost, low effort tweaks. And then monitor progress after you do that. If you get to less than 50 points out of 100, you're ending up with an unhealthy system. It's significantly impaired in multiple ways, and you may need major rethink of how your grazing system is, or you may have to add some infrastructure, some water systems, some cross fences, some other ways of moving the cattle around so that they're having a less footprint on the pasture. So variants of pasture health, well, I introduced you to a tame variant. Well, there's also a native grassland assessment. It answers similar types of questions, slight variations on the questions. A woody encroachment has been merged into structure and function. The complicated thing is that the native assessment is comparing an ideal reference plant community against the one you have that you're looking at. And so we use plant community guides to help us with this. And we're also considering the soil's potential as we do this, because not all soils are the same. They don't all have the same potential. Good example is this wet meadow soil here. We know in the foreground, the potential is a productive marsh or wet meadow community. But obviously the grazing system in the background is not allowing that pasture to reach that potential. And here's an example of a page out of one of those plant community guides that tells you what plants to expect. In the bottom here, it will tell you what to expect for cover of moss, litter, bare soil, and it'll often tell you how much productivity comes out of that plant community. Like the tame pasture, the first question gives you the option if you don't have the best plant species composition, like if you have more tame species, and when it's supposed to be a native, you have the option to answer a 1B question. In Manitoba, the threshold is 50%. In Alberta, the threshold is more lenient at 30% native forages. Okay, Saskatchewan also has pasture health assessment. It has the native one and it also has a woodland one. For ours, you can see the Manitoba Forage and Grassland website under projects for that one. Woodland pasture, again, it's looking at the same indicated questions, the plants we want to have, the structure and function, bare soil, litter protecting the soil, and lack of noxious weeds and woody regrowth. The major difference with a forested assessment would be in how we assess the litter question. Instead of hand raking litter, we're punching a pencil through the leaf litter layer and seeing how easy it is to push that pencil, how deep it goes. And that gives us an indicator of the thickness and sponginess of that layer that absorbs moisture and provides nutrients to the plant community. So to summarize, what I've introduced to you is what is range and pasture health assessment, or the ability of a plant community to function. What are the basic indicators that we use on the prairies in Canada? I've given you a feel for the procedure and types of questions that are asked as part of the assessment. And I've shown you where you can find information about how to do these different assessments. So I think with that, I will quit here. If you'd like to get a hold of me, my name and the Agriculture Canada server, agr.gc.ca. And of course, Pam and Sean also know how to get a hold of me. So I'll conclude with that.
That's great, May. Thank you so much. I have a quick question for you with regards to litter. I noted that you had a one-liner there with regards to too much litter.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe you can comment a little bit on what is considered too much litter or effective litter, I guess maybe is a better way to phrase it.
Yeah, like traditionally in Alberta and Saskatchewan, the more they've always took the perspective that more litter is better. But from my experience in Manitoba, I'm like, and people I've talked to, it's like, okay, yeah, you can have too much litter, it can stifle. Like if I see all litter and I don't see any grass poking up through it, that's something's not right about that. Just like one of the first pictures I showed you, you have a nice big blue stem community, but one side is flowering and the other side is not. So the thing isn't allowed to perpetuate itself. We're not certain what those thresholds are, but I mean, you can go out and look in your pasture and you can say, well, there's a lot of litter here, if I dig in amongst it, or am I getting these tiny, skinny little grasses trying to poke up? You can do a little experiment. You can push some of the litter away and allow it to grow over time, and you can understand, yeah, if I push this litter away, I'm getting more grass production. This amount of litter is just too much. So yeah, I can't give you a number, but I can help you understand how to figure it out for yourself.
For sure. And I guess another question is, what is the best time to do these pasture assessments?
For me, my favorite time to do the pasture assessments is before it's been grazed off, so I can see very well all the plants that are there. So that would be generally mid-June to at the very latest mid-August, depending on when the people are grazing. It gets very hard after it's been grazed because the plant community hasn't been allowed to recover, right? And there's elements that you're not seeing, especially species-wise, because cows ate it.
Great. Are there any questions, Sean or Aaron?
Yeah, May, thanks for the presentation. I guess question I had, what are some of the main causes of poor pasture health and maybe remedies that you've seen?
Quite often it's overgrazing. Now, what do we mean by overgrazing? Well, that would be grazing a pasture that doesn't allow the pasture to recover. So long durations of grazing and usually continuous grazing where the cattle can go to the same spot and graze, and then when it regrows, graze it off. So basically the plants are being mined, right? And of course, cattle are grazing the good species, and those other species that they're not grazing, well, they have the competitive advantage, right? So that would be a very key thing that's causing reduced pasture health. And I don't know if Miranda's gonna present more about beneficial grazing practices.
Well, with that, I guess we'll turn the mic over to Miranda and we'll answer that question as she's presenting.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, thank you. I'm going to kind of go back to some more of the basics of grazing management and things to consider as we're heading into this grazing season. So I think one of the most important grazing decisions we're going to make as a land manager is really when are we going to that start date. And a lot of producers I work with, it's based off of history. What have we done? And when can we get people to help us if we're branding and working those animals before we get them out? And so it tends to be more of this is the weekend we have our branding, and maybe not based off of what's actually going on in those pastures. And so that's what we're going to talk about a little bit more today is some of those considerations if those pastures are ready to be grazed and those impacts of grazing too early or too late. So if we're grazing too early, some of the things we see is we're going to reduce that leaf area of that plant and the vigor of that plant, and because that plant's not going to be able to have that leaf area to capture sunlight and grow and be healthy, which in the long run is going to reduce forage production. Some of the work we've done shows that by grazing too early, we can reduce forage production by up to 60% in that growing season. And then that's going to make that grassland more vulnerable to disease, insect infestations, and weed infestations. And part of that's because we're going to have more bare ground and places for those weeds to come into that pasture or that rangeland. However, on the other side is if we graze too late, we're going to see some forage losses, because if we're able to graze early and we don't graze too heavily, which we'll talk about more, is we can capture some regrowth on those plants and get bonus grass or bonus forage. But if we graze too late and that plant has become mature and set seed, then we're losing some of that potential for regrowth, or minimizing that potential for regrowth and additional forage. And I think in a year like this year is looking to be here in North Dakota, and I know in parts of Manitoba as well, we want to be able to capitalize on that precipitation and growth as much as we can. The other thing is, as those plants mature, the palatability and the quality of those plants also decline, which then is going to impact performance of your livestock. One thing, and May kind of touched on this, is also this can facilitate the invasion of exotic cool season grasses, In our rangelands, we see Kentucky bluegrass, brome grass coming in because they grow at a different time, and they are able to start their growth a little earlier in the growing season than some of our native cool season grasses, and especially before our warm season grasses. It gives them a competitive advantage. And so if we're waiting too long, we're not going to be able to keep them in check, and we're going to lose diversity and potentially forage production on our pastures. So what is grazing readiness? What does it look like? There's a couple ways we can measure it. The easiest is just looking at your pastures and looking at your grasses. For our tame grasses, so our bromes, our crested wheatgrass, that is going to be the 3-leaf stage. Just simply when that plant has 3 fully extended leaves. For our native cool season grasses or native grasses, it's 3.5-leaf stage. And so you'll have 3 fully extended leaves and another leaf that is halfway extended. So really that's the easiest way. You can also calculate growing degree days. But the simplest way is just go on looking at your plants. And it's nice to get out and look at grasslands. So some of the factors that can influence our grazing readiness is the species of grasses, which I touched on a little bit. So those tame grasses versus our native grasses, but also our cool season versus warm season grasses are going to start growing at different times. So our cool season grasses will start initiating that growth in the spring once we've, and I'm in Fahrenheit, sorry, so forgive me for this, but 32 degrees Fahrenheit for 5 consecutive days as their average temperature. It has to be that or higher, and that's when those plants really take off. Where warm season grasses need to get to 42 degrees. So that's really important to understand what grasses we have out there, especially the dominant or key grass species that are in that pasture. Available moisture is going to influence this as well, and that ability to get those plants growing in the spring right away. Weather, and so also that would be, what's the average temperature and getting to that average temperature to maintain that growth. And then management is a really big factor as well, especially management that previous grazing season, but also how early are we getting out there, as we already talked about. So as we think about the grasses we have, and in our grasslands, we need to understand too is how do those grasses grow? And so here's some of our key species we have. We have western wheatgrass, so one of our dominant cool season native grasses, Kentucky bluegrass, one of our most common invasive cool season perennial grasses, and blue grama. It's one of the most common warm season grasses. And you see how the rate of growth for these species and kind of the timing of precipitation. So really critical for our grasslands. And I know this will be delayed a little bit for you compared to us because you're a little farther north, but for us, it's that late April through July 1 precipitation is really key for the growth of our grasses, our cool season grasses. And then it's through the beginning of August for our warm season grasses. And we also get an additional flush of growth in the fall, especially on the Kentucky bluegrass and some of our native cool seasons, if we get that precipitation at that right time. So understanding how those grasses grow and what you have out in your pasture is really important because that's going to influence your grazing readiness in that pasture. And then I think it's really important too is be kind of building off of that. This shows the growing degree days for different grass species to reach grazing readiness. And you see for our crested wheatgrass, it's 443 days versus for our western wheatgrass or green needlegrass, 2 of our cool season natives, we're over 1,000 days to get to grazing readiness. And so I think that's another factor of why knowing what grazing resources you have across your property, those tame grass species, our native grass species is really important to be able to get the most out of our grasslands. And this is a visual representation of some of our resources. So if your crested wheatgrass here, it typically is ready to graze early May, our bromes mid-May, and then our post-contract CRP land, which our conservation reserve program lands here would be a lot of it's intermediate and tall wheatgrass later in May, and our native cool season grasses really late May in an optimal year, but usually it's early June that those are ready to be grazed. Kentucky bluegrass has really become common to dominant on some of our grassland rangelands. There's a lot of unknowns with Kentucky bluegrass. So some of the work that's been done here in North Dakota by the Agriculture Resource Service in Mandan, looking a little closer at Kentucky bluegrass development, it doesn't develop the same way as some our other grasses. So they're thinking 2-leaf stage might be grazing readiness for Kentucky bluegrass. However, within the same stand, you can have plants that are at a 1-leaf stage, a 2-leaf stage, a 3-leaf stage. And so it's really uneven across that stand of how that grass is responding and growing. Also, it goes to seed early in early June. And so management's really important to be able to capture and graze that forage before it matures and loses quality, and it's already a lower quality grass. However, it does have a high potential for fall regrowth because of its rooting structure and the thatch layer that goes with it. It captures rainfall very effectively. So it does well in a year with adequate precipitation. But lots of unknowns with Kentucky bluegrass. One thing that is really important as we think about our grasslands and going into this grazing season is what happened last year. And I wish I had the precipitation map that was shown earlier, but this is the drought map that I was able to find for Canada. And why it's important is most of we're cool season dominant on a lot of our grasslands. And our cool season species start their growth in the fall. And so they put up a tiller in the fall. And when it's stressed, if it's drought or grazing pressure stress, that tiller can die and that plant has to start growing again in the spring. And so that's going to delay our growth. This visual from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln shows where that growing point is. So if we graze between that growing point, that's when in the fall, or any time of year, that plant is going to, or that tiller is going to stop growing. And so, and in the sense of it, in the instance of the tiller, that tiller is not going to survive the winter. And so when we think about where that is located, it's going to vary depending on where we're at in terms of developmental stage of that grass. And so it gets higher as we go through those stages. And so we have to manage our grazing appropriately. But the general rule of thumb when I'm talking and we're out in the field looking at things is between those first 2 leaves. And so if you look at the picture of the Western wheatgrass tiller, it's pretty low yet because this tiller is just starting to grow. So what we found in terms of tiller development, and this is just from drought. So we went through drought in 2017. The first picture is the spring of 2017 and is Western wheatgrass at the 3.5 leaf stage in the central part of the state in early May, which it's west central. West is always ahead of us over here in the valley. But the following year, after going through that drought, we've seen a delay in our grazing readiness by about a week. And it was we see a significant delay. So about a week later, a year later, we were only at the 1.5 leaf stage. Overall, across the extension agents in the counties I worked with in this project, monitoring this, we've seen an average of a 2-week delay just from drought, not from management, just from those drought impacts. When we talk about management, we did a study that looked at that a little closer following our 2021 drought here in North Dakota. And we looked at how management and the condition of that stand in the fall impacted both growth and production that following grazing season. So we looked at slight to moderate use, which we defined as less than 65% of the plant height was grazed. full use, which was 65 to 80% of palatable plant height graze. So those plants that they prefer to graze. And the close use was greater than 80% palatable plant height graze, and greater than 10% low value plants graze. And we also looked at severe. Severe was defined as greater than 80% of all plants were grazed. And those, I'm looking at this close, I'm sure you can imagine that the severe pretty much look like a putting green without the green. So here's for Western wheatgrass what we found, and we did this 2 years in a row because we're trying to decide. The initial year we kind of had the feeling, looking at our data, that it was more of a management than a drought impact. And so we did this another year after a year of adequate precipitation, and we've seen the same trends for the most part, especially in our native grasses. You see that across both years, was impacted by our grazing use, and with it being lower in our close and severe use and higher in our slight to full use. One thing I thought was especially interesting, based off of our level of Kentucky bluegrass or June grass invasion here in the state, is the influence of drought on that grass species. And to me, it really brought forth the importance of managing for diversity in our rangelands because of the low drought resilience of our Kentucky bluegrass. And so grazing management, that following year, we've seen, if we had severe growth, really knocked back that Kentucky bluegrass in comparison to our other grazing treatments, but it still wasn't high on our full or close either. And that's partially right due to that shallow root structure of our Kentucky bluegrass. It did rebound quickly, and so in 23 we've seen this similar trend, but it was muted in comparison to 2022. We've seen similar trend in terms of forage production across those different grazing uses, with just above 1,000 pounds per acre on our severe use, so greater than 80% use. And it was pretty similar between our close and our full use. Just some kind of considerations as we head into our grazing season. If we're going to graze or need to get animals out early, and I know we have people here, we had some snow last week, calving pastures are a muddy mess, so people are kicking some animals out. But some things to consider then, if we're going to do that, to minimize those impacts, especially on our native cool seasons, that and even our tame cool seasons aren't doing much right now for how cold it's been, is supplementing on that pasture hayland. I mean, why we wanted to supplement with and provide supplemental forage on pasture and hayland is we want to reduce the potential of bringing in introduced species on our native rangeland. If we're going to graze a pasture, let's focus on those pastures that have our tame grasses, because they do recover a lot quicker from early grazing than our native pastures. One, if you have them, utilizing those winter annuals for spring grazing. So our winter rye, which would be the most common one we use here, triticale, winter wheats, they're a really great resource to extend our grazing season without having that negative impact on our perennial grasslands. If we have to go on to native range, let's look at that composition and dominant species on that native range and select something that has a lot of smooth brome grass, Kentucky bluegrass, those introduced species that maybe we can kick them back, knock them back a little and improve diversity while also getting some forage out of them. And yeah, and then if we don't have that as an option, which the way things are right now, most people have that as an option, I feel like, because Kentucky bluegrass has really taken off in the last decade. but is grazing native pastures that are dominated by our cool seasons versus those that are dominated by our warm seasons. Just in summary, really the key thing that I want people to walk away with is just knowing those key grass species on the grasslands you're grazing. You don't need to know everything. I'd say 5 to 10 species, and you'd have a really good handle of what are the key plants that are out there on your grazing lands, so that you can better manage them based off of when they're going to be ready to graze, how they recover from grazing. You know, those cool seasons, putting up that tiller and, you know, making sure that we're protecting that tiller growth in the fall. Monitor the grazing readiness of those key grass species. So when we make those decisions, obviously we have a diversity across our range, our pastures, rangeland. So we want to make sure that we're managing for those key species and not making a decision off of a species that's just a small component of that pasture. If estimating and not going out to look at those pastures, make sure you're using growing degree days to select your turnout date, instead of just selecting a date based off of history. If we have grazed heavy in the past, make sure we're allowing adequate recovery following that overuse, so that those rangelands are able to continue to be productive in the future. From work that's been done in the region, 1 year of overuse isn't going to have a long-term detrimental effect on our grazing lands, especially our native rangeland. And so just make sure that if we graze it heavy, let's give it a break in the spring and let it recover before we get animals out there again. Minimizing those repeated years of overuse, because that will have long-term impacts on our forage production. And especially seeing how dry you guys have been over the winter, is really making sure you're looking at that grazing readiness, and don't graze ahead of your grasses. Turning out too early this year, you're going to run out of grass fast. And with the current outlooks for here, and I'm guessing they're similar there, we might have some drought issues. And so making sure we are capturing that rainfall and getting forage growth out of that, and not getting ahead of those grasses and running out of forage. Here's my contact information. We definitely have publications, reports on some of the data I reference. Reach out if you want more information. And if you want to keep up with some of the research we're doing, you can follow me on social media.
Great. Thank you very much, Miranda. That was, some really good pointers. One of the things that you mentioned early in your presentation, which I think is a really effective tool and pretty easy to measure, is that plant readiness in terms of the 3-leaf stage on the grass plants. You don't necessarily need to know what species the grasses are, but pretty much anybody can count 3 leaves. And so when you're saying don't get ahead of the grasses in terms of grazing, I think that's a really good standard practice that many producers should follow. When do you think, or I guess, how many plants or spots in the field on a particular paddock should producers look at measuring when they're looking at that as a guide?
That's a great question. And I know a lot of us just want to drive inside that gate and move on to the next thing. But I think it depends on the variability in that pasture. And so making sure that you're covering that pasture well enough that you're looking at the different ecological sites, different plant communities that potentially are across that pasture, especially when we're native. I'd say a minimum of 5 in tame grass, because there's not as much variability typically in our tame grass pastures, just because they're planted, and so it's usually a convenient place to plant. But a minimum of 10 on our native range, and make sure you're looking at all the key species. So if you have codominant species, make sure you're looking at those codominant species. If it's like a western wheatgrass, green needlegrass community, for example.
Great. Are there any other questions?
Miranda, you had mentioned that grazing too early will decrease the yield by up to 60%. I guess that's similar to what we've set up here for years, where a day early grazing will reduce the days of grazing in the fall by up to 3 days. So it's pretty close when you do the math. Can you maybe clarify when you were talking about the grazing readiness of the forages and the height measurement, when 1 year it was at one height and then the next year was reduced? Was that because of drought the previous year? I just maybe missed a little bit of that.
So with the Kentucky bluegrass, it was definitely a drought impact that first year. But with the trends being similar across both years, it was more of a function. It was a greater function of management than precipitation.
So if it was too hard a grazing or too high stocking rates, that led to the slower development the following year.
And lower production, yeah.
And if it's looking like it's drier, because Manitoba has been below normal precipitation this winter, so if it looks like we're going into a drier season, should we then delay our maybe turnout or the start of grazing this year to try and give the chances a better chance to be more productive, I guess?
I think it depends on what you have for forage and grazing resources. If you have that ability, especially on your native, yes, but we don't want to delay too long. And so a really great option, depending on what species you have, is going through your pastures quickly, so that they're grazing and that you're able to capture regrowth. If it rains. Other thing is, looking at how can we fit annual forages in, and I know we don't want to put that risk of putting them in now, but watching as we get into July, and if the outlooks change and we have some timely rain, maybe getting some annual forages in for some fall grazing, so that we can offset those impacts to our perennial grasslands. I think always it's critical that we have some type of drought plan in place, especially, once we get to July 1 with being cool season dominant, that we're not going to get much more forage growth. And we're pretty much capped out when we get to July 1. There's some potential for that fall regrowth, but it's definitely, we don't want to bank on that, because 80 to 90%, depending on your species composition, of your forage growth is done by July 1. And so having that drought plan in place, especially, and trigger dates. So if I get to July 1 and this is where we're at, we're behind this percent in forage growth, and this is definitely individual ranch decision. These are the animals I'm going to cull, or I'm going to move them to another place where they're not impacted by drought, whatever that might be. But having those things in place now before we're in the middle of the drought is really important. Especially, other thing is maybe looking at pricing out hay. We had pretty good forage production last year, so I think we're okay. Most of our producers are sitting okay in terms of hay reserves, especially with not having a hard winter here. But pricing out hay now, because the drought is fairly widespread, and so getting those resources ahead of time, if that's part of your plan, before those prices go up, I think is really important.
Good points, thanks.
Okay, well, I definitely want to thank you, Miranda and May, for your presentations. They were very, very informative, and appreciate the time you took to share with us today. So I will just mention a few more comments with regards to our webinars here. That concludes the StockTalk webinars, but we also do have the Crop Talk webinars, which will be starting on April 16th. So you can scan the QR code here, or go to the link that is listed for the crop talks that happen, I believe, weekly here in Manitoba with Manitoba Agriculture crop specialists. Another event that we do have is a Manitoba Agriculture Pasture Tour, That will be happening on June 23rd, starting in St. Rose, going through to Alonza. We have a number of stops selected for that. So watch for the MBP e-newsletter and Manitoba Agriculture social media and our website for more information on that. The deadline to apply will be Friday, June the 20th. Just a reminder, if you do need any livestock manifests or fact sheets, the crop or beef cost of production calculators, everything is on our website or in our MASC offices. So just stop by to pick those up. And I just wanted to mention a shout out to our livestock and forage extension specialists here in the province. We have 4 of us, which myself in Dauphin, Cindy in the Arborg office, Elizabeth in Roblin, and Kristen in the Beausejour office. This is a list of crop extension specialists throughout the province as well. And these are MASC offices that are operating right now. We have 2 that are supposedly opening up on the other side of the mountains here in the fall. So look forward to having a few more offices as well. And just a reminder that you can find a lot of information on our website, including all of our programming and information with regards to our extension. So that concludes today's Stock Talk and the Stock Talk webinars for this season. I just want to mention that we would really like to have you fill out a post-evaluation survey. It will be emailed to everyone as well that has registered for Stock Talk, but you can scan the QR code, and we would really like to have feedback with regards to how informative or information that you would like to hear in the future or speakers you would like to hear. So please take a few moments to fill out the copy and return it to us with the address that will be provided in the email. So thank you for joining us for this season's Stock Talk, and we will see you back in the fall.